Morning S3. Today's lesson is going to be on work for the week beginning the 4th of May. And this is going to be on the weather topic, which you've already been working on in the first couple of weeks of term. You need to make sure you have opened up the main task for this particular week, which will look something like you can see on your screen in front of you. If you haven't done so, make sure that is open. And I'm going to talk you through that, as well as doing a little bit of teaching during today's lesson, as well as directing you to some other video resources I would like you to watch, which are connected to links that I've put into the lesson outline for this week. Like with the first couple of weeks of term, I'd like all work to be completed in the virtual weather topic note set. And this work you should aim to complete this by Thursday, the 7th of May, and hand it in to Mr. Anderson and myself for marking and feedback. Now, in the first couple of weeks, we've been working on looking at how to describe weather as it changes, as well as describing patterns across the UK. So I'm just going to bring that up in front for you to have a look at. And most specifically, the final few tasks that you were working on me and Miss Anderson were looking for you to be able to explain why the temperatures were varying across the UK, and you were given a textbook task last week, which you had to complete for why the temperatures vary, and there were some tutorial videos on that, as well as a task on why rainfall varies across the UK. And you should check your note set, your virtual note set, for feedback on how you did those tasks, because those two particular questions could possibly be exam questions. So have a little look at the feedback you've given. You will have been given some feedback on that. That's quite important stuff. This week, we're going to specifically look at two main aspects, which you will see in your weather note set. And these are focused at, if I can just jump back to this, at this idea of things called air masses and air masses and then air pressure. And in both cases, air masses and air pressure influence the weather that we see across the UK, and to a large extent help us understand why our weather is so changeable. So why can it be really sunny on one day and cold and cloudy on another? Why can it be really heavy rain, light rain, no rain at all? Why does it snow? Why doesn't it snow? Why do the temperatures vary? And not just across the year, but from one day it could be 10 degrees, next day it could be 15, following day it could be 5. And we in the UK live sandwiched between a large continent to the east of our island and a large ocean to the west. And that, to a large extent, explains our weather, which I'm going to talk to you more about today. So first thing you need to be doing, obviously, if you're watching this video lesson, you've done this first part, which is watching my lesson. You need to open up your note set. Now, if you're using the PDF, the only reason for me to give you a PDF is so the page numbers don't ever change, whereas in your virtual note set, because you're obviously typing answers into your virtual note set, your page numbers do change. So from the PDF, this would be page 12, or if you're just in your virtual note set, it's going to be the bit titled, What are air masses? And I've got a little video that goes on to explain what air masses are. I just want to have a little look at this and just talk a little bit about air masses, although the video is quite good and it does tell you what they are. And I want to look at the task. So I'm just waiting for the PDF to load up. So I'll just scroll down. So in your note set, what are air masses? Well, an air mass is a large area of the surface of the planet that has a very similar characteristic in terms of its temperature and the amount of moisture in that air. And we call that huge area. And when I say huge, these are areas that can cover whole continents. The temperature is going to be largely the same wherever you are within that air mass. That's the first thing. And the second thing is that the amount of moisture in the air, whether there is a lot or whether there's very little, will be very similar wherever you go. So if we just have a little look at this page, we can see here that we have the Atlantic Ocean and we are in what we would call a warm air mass. So everywhere coming from the south, coming from the equator, any air coming from this kind of region of the planet is going to always be warm. But because we're over an ocean in this case, we're over the Atlantic right here, there's going to be a lot of evaporation because warm air is going to cause water to evaporate from the ocean. And therefore, air coming from this region is going to be wet. It's going to be warm, it's going to be wet. Now, we call those air masses tropical air masses. You can see that there. And we call them tropical because they come from the tropical regions of the planet, and therefore they are warm. We also call them maritime air masses because they're coming, in this case, from an ocean. Okay, and you can see that this air mass is heading from the Atlantic and would be coming towards the UK. So this air mass is actually named a tropical maritime air mass. Its cousin, which is very similar, which comes from Africa down here, down to the south of Europe, is very similar in the case it's tropical, therefore the air is going to be warm. But there is one big difference. Unlike coming from the Atlantic Ocean, it's coming from a continent down here, in this case Africa, from a large continent. And because there is no water sitting on a continent, or there's very little, there's going to be very little evaporation. And therefore, unlike an ocean and a maritime air mass, this is going to be a very dry air mass. And we therefore call it continental. So it's maritime because it's warm, but it's continental because it comes from the continent. Now, the final thing you can see on this little weather map here is that the point where air masses actually meet, and in this case, we've got this huge front where the cold air masses, the polar ones, whether they're continental or whether they're maritime, are meeting the warmer air masses, whether they are maritime or whether they are tropical. And they have a meeting point. It's almost like a massive wall. And we call this a weather front. And the most famous, I suppose, of these weather fronts as we know them would be something that you've probably heard of called the jet stream. And there is in later today's video a little bit of a lesson that talks a little bit about the jet stream and talks about weather fronts. But that's a little introduction to air masses. I'm just going to scroll down a little bit, actually jump back here and have a little look at the task, because once you've watched this video, you then got to answer the task, which is ask you to describe and explain the different air masses. So if we just go further, once you've read all of this, describe and explain the likely weather based on your knowledge of air masses for the locations marked on the map. Okay, and Canada has been done for you. Now, describing is just saying what the air is going to be like. Explaining is because it's part of a certain air mass. So if we just have a little review of Canada, to describe the weather in Canada, we would say the weather in Canada is going to be cold and it's going to be dry. Now, how do I know it's going to be cold and it's going to be dry? Well, if I have a look at the air mass that's sitting over it, first of all, Canada is part of a continent. So because it's part of a continent, it's going to be dry because air that comes from continents doesn't contain much water moisture. I know it's going to be cold because the air right now sitting over Canada is coming from the poles. We can see this by the blue. And therefore, it's going to be cold air coming down from the poles. So my description would be, it would be a dry cold in Canada. And this is because, as I said here, because it's a polar air mass. So what does a polar air mass do? Well, it tells me it's dry because Canada's part of a continent. And it's therefore little water evaporates to form rain. What I'd also say is it's going to be cold because the air is coming from a polar area. And I've said that in the first sentence. So what I want you to do in this question is tell me about the other areas. What's Western Ireland going to be like? Think about, okay, is it part of a continent? Yes, but it's right next to a massive ocean. There is a warm air mass right now from the Atlantic Ocean. Iceland is in the middle of an ocean, in the Atlantic in this case, but it's sitting in an area of cold air. Russia is part of a huge continent. And it's sitting in an area of cold air, and Turkey is sitting in the middle of a large continental region, not just Asia, but next to Africa, and it's got warm air. So I should be able to tell whether they are continental air masses or maritime air masses. And I should be able to tell you whether these air masses are wet or dry. And therefore, I expect you to see in Western Ireland and in Turkey, in Iceland, in Russia, and you should then give me the because statement and then tell me how you know that the temperature is hot or cold and how you know whether it is wet or dry. Okay, right, let's move on to the next bit, which is the UK and its 5 air masses. This is all quite kind of self-explanatory. The task asks you to read some textbook material and then describe the origins and characteristics of the 5 air masses that influence the UK. And you can see I've done the first one for you. So the origin is just where does it come from? Okay, so in the case of a tropical maritime, it's an air mass that comes from the Atlantic. That's its origin. If we have a look at the map here, we can see that this air mass, the tropical continental, its origin is North Africa. So that's where it originated. That's where the air came from. Moving on a little bit, we then want to say what is its characteristics. Well, then we just need to know a little bit about what that type of air is. And when you read the textbook, you'll find out what the main kind of weather characteristics, whether that's to do with whether it's wet or dry, humid or non-humid, hot or cold, and where the winds are likely to come from when you have weather being linked to one of these air masses. So there are 5. I've done one for you. I'd just like you to summarize the other 4. Okay. Moving on to this lovely little bit on prolonged, getting an air mass for a prolonged period of time. And the first thing you have to understand here is, what does a prolonged period of time mean? Well, it just really means having weather for 2 weeks or more, sitting in an area where it's like that non-stop, day and night. So we could be talking about a hot air mass coming up from Africa, sitting over Britain for a whole month, bringing hot and really dry weather non-stop for 3-4 weeks, like we occasionally get in Scotland in the summer. Or we could be looking at, as my example here, the beast from the east, which came from Russia, from Siberia. And this was really cold air that passed over the North Sea as it came to the UK. And because it passed over the North Sea, it picked up a whole bunch of snow, which it then dropped on us. And then what we then had after the original snowfall is we then had sort of 2 or 3 weeks of extremely cold temperatures. And of course, the snow didn't melt because it was incredibly cold, even though it didn't really snow much after the original snowfall, if you can remember the beast back in 2018. So you have a little read of that. There are a couple of questions on the following page. You'll see I've given you some material to use. I've got a lovely weather report on the beast from the east down here. I'm just going to go down a little bit further. So I've got these 2 videos about weather fronts. So this one's a nice explainer of when 2 air masses meet. And this next video here is a story of the beast from the east and how it affected and disrupted Britain. And then what we need to do is scroll down to the following page and answer the question that goes with this. So it's just being a bit slow today. Here we are. So I've given you a couple of photographs to go along with this. There we are. And the question says, each of the following describe the impact that the arrival of the air mass would have on people in the UK if this air mass remained for a longer time. So tropical continental air mass in summer, tropical continental, that means it's going to be hot because it's tropical. It's going to be dry because it's continental. And it's summertime. And it arrives in Britain and it's going to bring clear skies. There'll be no winds. It'll be baking hot during the day. Probably temperatures will drop a bit at night because you'll have clear skies, and you're going to get no rain for weeks on end. How would that affect the UK? What are the positives and negatives for people? Now, the photograph has one strong suggestion, but think about lots of other possibly even negative effects of having extreme heat for a long period of time, and how that would then affect us. And I'm looking for 5 ideas, 5 descriptions for the impacts that air mass would have. Then I'd like to tell me about a tropical maritime air mass in winter. Now, this is going to be warm. but it's coming from the ocean and it's wintertime. So what this kind of air mass is going to do is it's going to bring an awful lot of rain, huge amounts of wind and storms. It's not going to be extremely cold. It's just going to be your typically really wet weather. You're going to get huge amounts of rain. That's the kind of the key clue, and you're going to get extremely strong winds if you get a tropical maritime air mass, and you get weeks of this in the wintertime. So tell me, what would be the 5 impacts of that kind of air mass hitting us non-stop for quite a few weeks in winter? Okay, give me 5 points there. Right, that brings us through some of the probably what I'd call the easier bits of the weather topic. We now enter in the final part of today's lesson into the harder stuff. And this is from the final few pages of the virtual note set for today. If I just click you back to the actual task. Now, it's all self-explanatory. I need you to do a bit of reading. And then I've got a video tutorial that I'll link to page 17 and 18 where I talk you through air pressure and what's the difference between high and low pressure? What kind of weather do you get with high pressure versus low pressure? I mean, I'm sitting in my back room in my house, and it's a beautiful blue sky right now, and it's spring. And the reason for that is we've got high pressure right now. That's the weather I'm experiencing. Now, by the time you watch this video, you might have a sky full of clouds, and it might be raining. I don't know. I can't predict the weather in a week's time or 2 weeks' time. If that's what you're seeing outside your window, then that's probably low pressure that you're experiencing right now. So this video will talk you through that along with pages 17 and 18. And then I'd like you to have a go at telling me about the weather in Glasgow and Frankfurt based on a weather map that I include. You will need to watch this tutorial here in order to have a go at that question. Okay, so that's the end of today's lesson. Thank you for listening. Good luck. Go through all the tasks, and once you're finished, by no later than 7th of May, submit your work, and me and Mr. Anderson will mark it.